Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished loading the last cargo container onto his ship. The docking bay of Nexus Prime was always hot and noisy, filled with beings from dozens of different worlds conducting their business. He had been making supply runs between human colonies for 3 years now, and the work was simple enough to keep his mind off the past. Lisa Parker appeared at his side, her tablet in hand and grease stains on her work clothes. She had been checking the ship's engines again, making sure everything was running perfectly for their next journey. Lisa was the smartest person Jake knew, and probably the only reason their small cargo business stayed profitable. "All systems look good," she said, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear. "We should be ready to leave as soon as you finish the paperwork." Jake nodded and headed toward the station's administrative office. The bureaucrats at Nexus Prime were notorious for their endless forms and procedures, but cargo pilots had no choice but to deal with them. The alternative was finding another place to refuel and resupply. And there weren't many options in this part of space. The Nexus Prime administrative office was a maze of desks and computer terminals, staffed by various alien species who seemed to enjoy making simple tasks as complicated as possible. Jake approached the first available clerk, a green-skinned Vorthok with 4 arms who was typing on multiple keyboards simultaneously. "Jake Morrison, cargo vessel registration number HC2847, Jake said, placing his identification card on the counter. "I need departure clearance for the Kepler colony run." The Vorthok clerk's 4 eyes looked at Jake's card, then at his computer screen, then back at the card. His fingers moved across the keyboards with surprising speed, making clicking sounds. That reminded Jake of rain on a metal roof. "There appears to be an issue with your registration," the clerk said in his translated voice. "The computer shows you have been enrolled in the Galactic Combat Championships." Jake blinked. "That's impossible. I'm a cargo pilot, not a fighter." "The computer does not make mistakes," the clerk replied, his tone suggesting that arguing would be pointless. "You are scheduled for your first match tomorrow at 1400 hours, Arena 7. "Look, there's obviously been some kind of mix-up," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I never signed up for any championships. I just want to get my cargo delivered and leave." The clerk's 4 arms moved in what might have been a shrug. "Computer records show proper registration was completed 2 days ago. If you wish to withdraw, you must speak with the Combat Council. However, withdrawal after registration requires payment of penalty fees equal to 50,000 credits. Jake felt his stomach drop. 50,000 credits was more money than he and Lisa had saved in the past 2 years. There was no way they could afford that kind of penalty, especially not for something that wasn't even their fault. He found Lisa waiting by their ship when he returned to the docking bay, and she could tell from his expression that something was wrong. When he explained the situation, her face went through several different emotions before settling on determined problem-solving mode. "So let me understand this," she said. "Some computer glitch signed you up for alien fighting matches, and if you don't participate, we owe them enough money to buy a new ship." "That's about right," Jake said. "The Combat Council office is closed until tomorrow morning, and my first fight is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon." Lisa was quiet for a moment, thinking, "What do you know about these championships?" "Not much. I've heard they're a big deal around here. Different alien species send their best fighters to prove who's the strongest or fastest or whatever. It's been going on for centuries, and humans have never participated." "I don't think so. We're pretty new to this whole galactic community thing, remember? Most aliens still think we're just another primitive species that got lucky with faster-than-light travel." Lisa nodded slowly. "Well, you do have military training. Maybe it won't be as bad as it sounds." Jake had been trying not to think about his military service. Those memories belonged to a different person, from a time when he believed in causes worth fighting for. After losing his entire squad to space pirates who ambushed their patrol ship, He had left the service and tried to build a quiet life hauling cargo between peaceful colonies. The next morning, Jake visited the Combat Council office as soon as it opened. The waiting room was filled with beings he had never seen before, some of them so large they required special seating, others so small they sat on elevated platforms. The variety of alien life forms never stopped amazing him, even after 3 years of traveling through galactic space. When his turn came, he was directed to a small office where a tall, thin alien with purple skin and silver eyes reviewed his case. The being introduced himself as Administrator Qualthin and explained that the registration had been processed correctly according to all procedures. "But I never signed up for this," Jake protested. "There has to be some mistake." "Administrator." Qualthin consulted his computer screen. The registration was submitted through the standard channels by an authorized representative using your identification codes. All documentation appears to be in order. Can't you just cancel it? I'm not a professional fighter. Cancellation at this stage would require unanimous consent from the Combat Council, which does not meet again until next month. The penalty fee remains your only option for immediate withdrawal. Jake left the office feeling trapped. 50,000 credits might as well have been 50 million for all the chance he had of paying it. He spent the rest of the morning walking around Nexus Prime, trying to figure out how he had gotten into this situation and how he was going to get out of it. The arena was larger than he had expected, with seating for thousands of spectators, arranged in concentric circles around a central fighting area. The crowd was already gathering when he arrived for his scheduled match, and the noise was incredible. Beings from dozens of different worlds were cheering, growling, chirping, and making sounds he couldn't even identify. His opponent was already waiting in the arena. When Jake arrived at the preparation area, Gorthok was a Bruthan, a species known for their size and strength. He stood nearly 3 meters tall and was covered in natural armor plating that looked like it could stop bullets. His forearms ended in claws that could probably tear through metal, and his face was dominated by tusks that curved down from his upper jaw. Lisa had insisted on coming with him, and she was studying the alien fighter with the same intensity she usually reserved for broken engines. "He's big and strong, but look at how he moves," she said. "All that armor probably makes him slow." Jake watched Gorthak practice his combat moves and had to admit Lisa was right. The Bruthan was powerful, but his movements were predictable. Every attack followed a clear pattern, like a machine following its programming. When the match began, the crowd expected it to be over quickly. Humans were not known as fighters in galactic society, and most beings in the arena had probably never seen one in combat. Jake could hear the betting odds being called out in multiple languages, and none of them favored the unknown human. Gorthak charged forward with exactly the kind of straightforward attack Jake had expected. Instead of trying to match the alien's strength, Jake stepped aside and let momentum carry his opponent past him. The Bruthan's claws scraped against the arena floor as he tried to stop himself, and Jake used that moment of imbalance to strike at the joints in the alien's armor. The fight lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, Gorthak was on the ground and Jake was still standing. The arena fell silent for a moment, as if the crowd couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Then the noise exploded again, but this time it was confused, murmuring, instead of confident cheering. Jake looked up at the spectator section and found Lisa in the crowd. She was grinning and giving him a thumbs-up sign. For the first time since the whole mess started, Jake allowed himself to think that maybe he could actually survive this tournament after all. The victory over Gorthak changed everything. Jake had expected to be eliminated in the first round and spend the rest of his time on Nexus Prime figuring out how to pay the penalty fees. Instead, he found himself advancing to the second round of the championships, with spectators and other competitors starting. To pay attention to the unknown human, Lisa spent the next 3 days studying everything she could find about the tournament and Jake's upcoming opponents. The station's library had detailed records going back centuries, and she threw herself into research with the same dedication she usually applied to engine modifications. She filled notebooks with information about fighting styles, alien anatomy, and combat techniques from across the galaxy. "Look at this," she said, spreading her notes across their ship's small table. "Every species in this tournament has specialized in one particular type of combat over thousands of years. The Zephyrians are built for speed and agility. The rely on their natural armor. The Velter use telepathy to predict their opponent's moves." Jake studied the information while cleaning his equipment. His military training had taught him to maintain his gear properly, a habit that had served him well during his years as a cargo pilot. "So what does that mean for me?" "It means they're all predictable in their own ways," Lisa said. "They've become so specialized that they can't adapt when they face something completely different. You're not bound by any particular fighting style. You can use whatever works." Jake's second opponent was a Zephyrian named Swift Claustrixtru, which was apparently a shortened version of his actual name. The Zephyrians were tall, thin beings with 4 arms and legs that bent in ways that would be impossible for humans. They moved like liquid mercury, flowing from one position to another with incredible grace and speed. The betting odds still favored the alien, but not by as much as they had for Jake's first fight. Word was spreading through Nexus Prime that the human had defeated a Bruthan warrior through skill rather than luck, and some spectators were beginning to wonder what other surprises he might have. Swift Claustrixtru lived up to his name, moving around the arena so quickly that Jake had trouble following his movements. The Zephyrian would appear on one side, strike, and vanish before Jake could react, only to appear somewhere else a moment later. After the first few exchanges, Jake was already breathing hard, while his opponent seemed barely warmed up. Lisa had warned him about this. Zephyrian combat doctrine relied on wearing down opponents through hit-and-run tactics until they were too exhausted to defend themselves effectively. The key was finding a way to force them into a different kind of fight. Jake stopped trying to follow Swift Claustrixtru's movements and instead focused on the arena itself. The fighting area had several features designed to make matches more interesting, including variable gravity fields that could be activated by stepping on certain floor panels. Most fighters avoided these areas because unpredictable gravity changes could disrupt their specialized techniques. The next time Swift Claustrixtru came in for an attack, Jake was ready. Instead of trying to dodge, he grabbed the Zephyrian and threw both of them toward one of the gravity field generators. The sudden change from normal gravity to 3 times normal gravity sent them both crashing to the floor. But Jake had been expecting it, while his opponent had not, in the heavy gravity field. Swift Claustrixtru's speed advantage disappeared. His thin limbs weren't built to support his body weight under increased gravity, and he struggled to move at all. Jake, who had trained in variable gravity during his military service, was able to adapt much more quickly. The match ended when the Zephyrian couldn't get back to his feet. The crowd's reaction was different this time. Instead of surprised silence, there was excited chatter as beings began to realize that the human was doing something unprecedented. Jake could see alien spectators pointing at him and engaging in animated discussions about his unconventional tactics. His third opponent was a Chronit called Stonebreaker Mountain Fist. The Chronits were living rocks, essentially, with silicon-based biology that made them nearly indestructible. Stonebreaker Mountain Fist stood over 2 meters tall and moved like a walking boulder. His punches could probably cave in the side of a building, but Jake had already learned that raw power meant nothing if it couldn't hit its target. Lisa had found something interesting in her research about Chronit physiology. Their bodies were incredibly tough, but they had one weakness that few fighters knew about. The joints between their rock-like plates were held together by a crystalline structure that could be shattered if hit at exactly the right angle with enough force. The problem is finding the right angle, Lisa explained. Their armor plating is designed to protect those weak spots. You'd need to get them to expose the joints somehow. Jake spent hours studying diagrams of chronet anatomy, memorizing the locations of the vulnerable points. When the match began, he knew he would have only 1 or 2 chances to exploit this knowledge before Stonebreaker Mountain Fist's superior strength overwhelmed him. The chronet's fighting style was exactly what Jake had expected, straightforward and powerful. Stonebreaker Mountain Fist threw punch after punch, each one capable of ending the match instantly if it connected. Jake concentrated on staying mobile, moving around the arena and waiting for his opportunity. It came when the chronet overextended himself during a particularly forceful attack. For just a moment, the crystalline joint at his shoulder was exposed and vulnerable. Jake struck with all his strength at precisely the right angle, and Stonebreaker Mountain Fist's arms separated from his body with a sound like breaking glass. The crowd went wild. No one had ever seen a chronet defeated by exploiting their anatomical weaknesses. Most species simply accepted that fighting a chronet meant dealing with an opponent who was essentially invulnerable, and they planned their strategies accordingly. Jake's success was becoming impossible to ignore. Galactic news services began covering his matches, and betting odds shifted dramatically as more spectators began to believe that the human might actually have a chance of winning the tournament. Alien fighters who had initially dismissed him as a curiosity were now studying recordings of his matches and trying to understand his methods. The Combat Council was also taking notice. High Arbiter Zekthal, the tournament's chief administrator, reviewed footage of Jake's matches with growing concern. The championships had always served as a demonstration of established galactic hierarchy, with the most advanced species consistently dominating the competition. A human victory would upset centuries of accepted social order. "This is highly irregular," Zekthal said to his assistants as they watched Jake's victory over Stonebreaker Mountain Fist. "How is a member of such a primitive species defeating opponents who should be vastly superior?" "Perhaps we should conduct additional testing," suggested one assistant. "There may be performance-enhancing substances or hidden augmentations." "Do that," Zekthal agreed. "There must be an explanation for these results that doesn't involve accepting human superiority over established galactic powers." Jake was subjected to extensive medical examinations after each match, but every test came back negative. He was completely natural, with no artificial enhancements or chemical assistance. His victories were the result of training, intelligence, and an ability to adapt that seemed unique among the species represented in the tournament. Lisa continued her research, but her focus was shifting from Jake's opponents to the tournament itself. She was beginning to notice patterns in how matches were scheduled, how rules were interpreted, and how the Combat Council made decisions about controversial situations. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that the tournament was designed to maintain existing power structures rather than truly determine the best fighters. "Look at this," she said, showing Jake a chart she had created. "The scheduling system ensures that fighters from lesser species always face opponents from superior species in early rounds. It's designed to eliminate challenges to the established order before they can gain momentum." "But I've been beating them anyway," Jake pointed out. "That's exactly the problem," Lisa said. "You're not supposed to be able to do that. The whole system is based on the assumption that certain species are naturally better fighters than others." Jake's fourth opponent was his biggest challenge yet, a Velter named Mind-Touched Deathbrings. The Velter were telepathic beings who could read their opponent's thoughts and predict their actions before they happened. Fighting one was considered nearly impossible because they knew what you were going to do before you did it. But Jake had spent years learning to control his thoughts and emotions during his military service. Combat situations required the ability to function despite fear, anger, and confusion, and he had developed mental discipline that few humans possessed. When Mind-Touched Deathbrings tried to read his intentions, Jake's chaotic human thought patterns proved difficult to interpret. The Veilter was used to opponents whose minds worked in predictable ways. Most alien species had streamlined their mental processes over millennia of evolution, eliminating the random thoughts and emotional noise that characterized human consciousness. Jake's mind was like trying to read a book while someone else was scribbling in the margins and changing pages randomly. The match lasted longer than anyone had expected. Mind-touch Deathbrings could sense Jake's general emotional state and physical condition, but couldn't predict specific actions. Jake, meanwhile, was learning to use his opponent's telepathic abilities against him by deliberately thinking about false plans and misdirection. When Jake finally landed the winning blow, the arena erupted in chaos. A human had just defeated a Veilter, telepathic warrior, something that most spectators would have considered impossible just days earlier. The victory guaranteed Jake a place in the tournament finals, making him the first human in galactic history to reach such heights in combat sports. High Arbiter Zekthal watched from the administrative box with growing alarm. The human was not just winning matches. He was demonstrating abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about galactic society. If a supposedly primitive species could defeat the most advanced fighters in known space, what did that say about the established order? As Jake celebrated his victory with Lisa, neither of them realized that their success had already made them targets of forces much larger than a simple fighting tournament. The championship final was scheduled for 3 days after Jake's victory over the Veilter warrior. Those 3 days felt like the longest of his life, as news of his unprecedented success spread throughout galactic space. Beings from hundreds of different worlds were traveling to Nexus Prime, just to witness what many were calling the most significant sporting event in galactic history. Lisa had barely slept during those 3 days, spending every waking moment researching Jake's final opponent. Therendar was a legend among the apex predators, a species that had been specifically bred for combat over thousands of years. His people came from a world where survival required constant fighting, and they had evolved into perfect killing machines. He's won the championship 3 times in a row, Lisa said, showing Jake the statistical analysis she had compiled. No one has ever lasted more than 10 minutes against him. Most matches end in under 5 minutes. Jake studied the recordings of Therendar's previous fights. The apex predator moved with fluid grace, despite his massive size, combining incredible strength with surprising speed. His natural weapons included retractable claws that could cut through metal, reinforced bone structure that could withstand tremendous impacts, and reflexes that seemed almost supernatural. He's everything I'm not, Jake admitted. Stronger, faster, better equipped for fighting. How am I supposed to compete with that? The same way you've been competing with everything else, Lisa said. You think differently than they do. Look at his fighting pattern. Every move is perfect, but it's also predictable. He's been trained to fight in a specific way, and he's never had to deviate from that training because it's always worked. The arena was packed beyond capacity on the day of the final match. Temporary seating had been installed to accommodate the massive crowd, and the betting odds were being broadcast live across the galaxy. Despite Jake's impressive tournament run, most observers still expected Therendar to win. The apex predators species had dominated galactic combat for centuries, and many believed it would take more than human determination to overcome such natural advantages. High Arbiter Zekthal addressed the crowd before the match began, speaking in the formal tones reserved for the most significant occasions. Today we witness a historic contest between the established champion of our galaxy's finest warriors and a remarkable challenger who has exceeded all expectations. May the superior being emerge victorious. The words seemed neutral enough, but Jake caught the subtle emphasis on superior being. The Combat Council clearly expected Therendar to restore the natural order by defeating the upstart human, and they weren't being subtle about their preferences. When the match began, Jake immediately understood why Therendar had never been defeated. The apex predator's first attack came so quickly that Jake barely managed to dodge it, and the claws left deep gouges in the arena floor where he had been standing a moment earlier. The creature's speed was incredible, but his strength was even more impressive. Each punch or kick carried enough force to shatter bones. Jake spent the first several minutes simply trying to survive. Therandar's attacks came in a relentless sequence, each one flowing naturally into the next, without any wasted motion. It was like fighting a perfect machine, designed for nothing but combat efficiency. But as the match continued, Jake began to notice something that Lisa's research had missed. Therandar's movements were indeed perfect, but they were perfectly predictable. The apex predator had learned the most efficient way to fight, and he never deviated from optimal techniques. This made him incredibly dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable to someone who was willing to do things that weren't optimal. Jake started making deliberately inefficient moves, attacks that no trained fighter would attempt because they left him exposed to counterattacks. Therandar responded exactly as his training dictated, but his perfect responses were designed for opponents who fought logically. Jake's seemingly random tactics began to disrupt the apex predator's rhythm. The crowd noticed the change. What had started as a one-sided beating was becoming something more complex. Jake was still taking tremendous punishment, but he was no longer simply trying to survive. He was actually landing some attacks of his own, finding gaps in Therandar's defenses that shouldn't have existed. 20 minutes into the match, both fighters were showing signs of fatigue. Therandar had never been challenged for so long, and his perfect technique was beginning to show small flaws. Jake was battered and bloodied, but he was still moving, still adapting, still finding new ways to surprise his opponent. The turning point came when Jake did something that violated every principle of combat training he had ever received. Instead of trying to avoid one of Therandar's powerful attacks, he deliberately moved into it, accepting a devastating blow to his ribs in order to get close enough to strike at the apex predator's vulnerable throat. The crowd gasped as Jake absorbed punishment that should have ended the match, but his desperate gamble paid off. His counterstrike caught Therandar completely off guard, and the apex predator staggered backward for the first time in the entire tournament. Jake pressed his advantage, ignoring his injuries and throwing everything he had into a sustained offensive. His attacks weren't as powerful as Therandar's, but they came from unexpected angles and targeted areas that no logical fighter would focus on. The apex predator's training hadn't prepared him for an opponent who was willing to sacrifice tactical advantage for strategic gain. The final exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. But it felt like an eternity to everyone watching. Theran attempted his signature finishing move, a combination of strikes that had never failed to end a match. Jake responded with something that wasn't really a technique at all, more like controlled falling, that somehow put him in position to deliver one final, desperate attack. When the dust settled, Therandar was on the ground and Jake was still standing. The arena fell completely silent for several long moments, as if the crowd couldn't process what they had just witnessed. Then the noise exploded in a wave that could probably be heard throughout the entire station. Jake Morrison had won the Galactic Combat Championships, becoming the first human in history to claim the title. The victory should have been the greatest moment of his life, but something felt wrong. Instead of celebration, he saw confusion and anger in many of the alien faces around him. Arbiter Zekthal's expression was particularly disturbing. The Combat Council leader was staring at Jake with what could only be described as horror, as if the human had committed some unforgivable crime by winning a fair fight. The victory ceremony was strangely muted. Jake was presented with the championship trophy and officially recognized as the Galactic Champion, but the usual pageantry felt forced and uncomfortable. Many of the dignitaries seemed reluctant to acknowledge his achievement, going through the motions without enthusiasm. Lisa was waiting for him when he finally escaped the post-match interviews and medical examinations. She was smiling, but he could see worry in her eyes. "Congratulations, champion," she said. "How does it feel to be the best fighter in the galaxy?" "Like I've made some very powerful enemies," Jake replied. "Did you see how they looked at me during the ceremony? It's like they think I cheated somehow." "That's because in their minds, you did cheat," Lisa said. "You weren't supposed to be able to win. The whole system is based on the idea that certain species are naturally superior to others. Your victory proves that idea wrong, and that threatens everything they believe about themselves." They were interrupted by an announcement over the station's communication system. "High Arbiter, Zekthal was calling for an immediate review of the championship results, citing irregularities in the competition that require investigation." "What kind of irregularities?" Jake asked. "The kind they're going to invent to justify taking away your victory," Lisa said grimly. "I don't think they're going to let this stand." Over the next several hours, Jake was subjected to every test the Combat Council could devise. They scanned him for performance-enhancing drugs, checked for cybernetic implants, analyzed his genetic structure, and even brought in telepathic specialists to examine his mental state. Every test came back negative, proving that his victory had been achieved through natural human ability alone. But instead of settling the matter, the negative results seemed to make the council more agitated. If Jake hadn't cheated, if he had won fairly using only his natural abilities, then their fundamental assumptions about galactic hierarchy were wrong. That was a conclusion they were not prepared to accept. High Arbiter Zekthal called an emergency session of the Combat Council, bringing together representatives from all the major galactic powers. The meeting was supposed to be private, but Lisa had developed contacts among the station's technical staff during her research. She managed to access audio recordings of the session, and what she heard confirmed her worst fears. "This human victory cannot be allowed to stand," Zekthal was saying. "If we accept that a primitive species can legitimately defeat our finest warriors, we undermine the entire basis of galactic civilization." "But all the tests confirmed that he won fairly," another voice protested. "Then we must find another solution," Zekthal replied. "The stability of our society depends on maintaining proper order. Lesser species must remain in their proper place, or chaos will result." Lisa shared the recording with Jake, and they both realized that their victory had become something much larger than a simple sporting achievement. They had accidentally challenged the fundamental power structure of galactic civilization, and those in power were not going to give up without a fight. "They're going to find a way to take this away from us," Jake said. "Yes," Lisa agreed. "But they're also going to have to show the entire galaxy exactly what kind of beings they really are in order to do it." Neither of them could have predicted just how far the Combat Council would be willing to go to preserve their vision of proper galactic order, or how their desperation would ultimately backfire in ways that would change everything. The emergency session of the Galactic Combat Council lasted for 18 hours. Representatives from across known space participated via quantum communication links, debating what to do about the human victory that had shaken the foundations of their carefully ordered society. Jake and Lisa waited aboard their ship, knowing that powerful beings were deciding their fate, but unable to influence the outcome. High Arbiter Zekthal had spent days reviewing every rule, regulation, and precedent in the tournament's 300-year history, searching for any legal justification to overturn Jake's victory. The testing had proved that the human had not cheated in any traditional sense. He had used no performance-enhancing substances, no cybernetic augmentations, no external assistance of any kind. By every established measure, his championship was legitimate, but legitimacy was not the same as acceptability. The major galactic powers had built their civilizations on the assumption that they represented the pinnacle of evolutionary development. Their superior technology, their dominant position in galactic politics, their control of trade routes and resources, all of this was justified by their supposed natural superiority over lesser species. Jake Morrison's victory threatened to expose that superiority as a myth. If humans could defeat the galaxy's finest warriors through nothing but natural ability and determination, then perhaps the established hierarchy was based on politics rather than merit. That was a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. The solution, when it came, was elegant in its simplicity. If the Combat Council could not prove that Jake had cheated, they would simply redefine what constituted fair play. Human fighting techniques would be declared inherently unfair, not because they violated any existing rules, but because they were fundamentally incompatible with civilized competition. Lisa was monitoring communication channels when the first hints of the decision began to leak out. Technical staff at Nexus Prime were talking about unusual activity in the council chambers, and some were expressing confusion about orders they had received to prepare for a major announcement. "They're planning something big," she told Jake. "The entire Galactic News Network has been placed on standby for a special broadcast." Jake was cleaning his equipment, a ritual that helped him think clearly. The tournament was supposed to be over, but he had learned to stay prepared for anything. Whatever they're planning, it's not going to be good for us. The announcement came 12 hours later, broadcast simultaneously across the galaxy on every major communication network. High Arbiter Zekthal appeared on screens throughout known space, his expression solemn and his tone carrying the weight of official authority. "Citizens of the galaxy," he began, "the Galactic Combat Council has completed its review of recent championship events. After careful consideration of all evidence and extensive consultation with experts in xenobiology and combat theory, we have reached a decision that affects the future of competitive fighting throughout civilized space." Jake and Lisa watched the broadcast from their ship, surrounded by dozens of other beings who had gathered in the docking bay to hear the announcement. The crowd included members of various species, but Jake noticed that most of them seemed to be from worlds that were considered lesser members of galactic society. The human competitor known as Jake Morrison has demonstrated fighting capabilities that, while technically within existing regulations, represent a fundamental threat to fair competition, Zekthal continued. Human neural patterns produce chaotic and unpredictable combat responses that give them an unfair advantage over species with more evolved and refined fighting traditions. Lisa grabbed Jake's arm. "They're actually doing it. They're changing the rules because you won. Our xenobiological experts have determined that human combat techniques exploit psychological and strategic variables that were never intended to be part of civilized martial competition," the High Arbiter said. "The human tendency toward irrational tactical choices, emotional decision-making, and unpredictable behavioral patterns creates an unbalanced competitive environment." The crowd in the docking bay was growing restless. Beings who had watched Jake's matches were talking among themselves in increasingly agitated tones. Many of them had placed bets on the human, but more importantly, they had seen something in his victories that resonated with their own experiences as supposedly inferior species. "Therefore," Zekthal announced, "the Galactic Combat Council hereby enacts Resolution 2387CC, which prohibits human participation in all sanctioned combat sports throughout galactic space. This resolution takes effect immediately and applies retroactively to all previous competitions." Jake felt his stomach drop. "Retroactively? They're taking away my championship. The victory achieved by the human competitor is hereby declared null and void," the High Arbiter confirmed. "The championship title reverts to the previous holder, Therendar, of the Apex Predators, who will retain his position until legitimate competition can resume." The docking bay erupted in angry voices speaking dozens of different languages. Even species that had never shown much interest in human affairs seemed outraged by the blatant unfairness of the decision. Jake could hear beings arguing about precedent, about justice, about what the resolution meant for their own participation in galactic society. Lisa was recording everything on her tablet, documenting the reactions and the announcement itself. They just proved that the entire system is rigged, she said. They literally changed the rules because they didn't like the results. The characteristics that make human combat techniques unfair include, but are not limited to, Zekthal continued, reading from a prepared statement, adaptive tactical thinking, emotional response, integration, unpredictable strategy, modification, and resistance to established combat doctrines. These traits are incompatible with the standardized competitive framework that ensures fair contests between civilized species. One of the beings in the crowd, a reptilian creature from a world Jake didn't recognize, stepped forward. "What about our species?" the being demanded in translated speech. "We also use adaptive tactics. Are we to be banned as well?" Similar questions came from other beings in the crowd. Many of the so-called lesser species employed fighting techniques that could be described as unpredictable or adaptive. The resolution seemed to target specifically human methods, but the language was broad enough to potentially affect dozens of other species. "High Arbiter," Zekthal's response was telling. "The resolution applies specifically to human combat characteristics. At this time, other species will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, as circumstances require." Lisa looked at Jake with grim understanding. Translation: "They'll ban anyone who gets too successful at challenging the established order." The announcement continued with technical details about enforcement and appeals procedures, but Jake had stopped listening. He was watching the faces of the beings around him, seeing anger and fear and recognition. They understood what this really meant. If the galactic powers could simply declare human success illegal, they could do the same to any species that threatened their dominance. When the broadcast ended, the docking bay remained full of agitated voices. Beings who had never spoken to each other before were now engaged in heated discussions about fairness, about power, about what it meant to live in a galaxy where the rules could be changed whenever the wrong species won. Jake and Lisa returned to their ship to find a message waiting for them. It was from President Amanda Foster of the human colonial government, requesting immediate communication. When they established the link, President Foster's expression was a mixture of pride and anger. "Mr. Morrison, on behalf of humanity, I want to congratulate you on your victory," she said. "What you accomplished in that arena was remarkable, and no political maneuvering can change that fact." "Thank you, Madam President," Jake replied. "But it looks like they've found a way to erase it anyway." "They've tried to erase it," President Foster corrected, "but erasure only works if people forget. The entire galaxy watched you defeat their champions fairly and honestly. They watched the Council declare your natural abilities illegal rather than admit you were better. That's not the kind of thing beings forget easily." Lisa leaned into the communication pickup. "What happens now? Are we in trouble for participating?" "Quite the opposite," President Foster said. "You've become symbols of something much larger than a fighting tournament. Reports are coming in from across human space of spontaneous celebrations. Our colonies are treating this as a victory for all humanity, not just for Mr. Morrison." "But they took away the championship," Jake said. "They took away a title," President Foster replied. "They can't take away what you proved. You showed the galaxy that humans are not the primitive species they believed us to be. More importantly, you showed every other supposedly inferior species that the established order might not be as natural or inevitable as they've been told." Over the next several days, the implications of Resolution 2387CC became clear. The ban on human participation in combat sports was just the beginning. Several major trade agreements were modified to exclude human businesses from certain sectors. Diplomatic meetings that had included human representatives were restructured to minimize human influence. The galactic powers were using Jake's victory as justification for a broader campaign to put humanity back in what they considered its proper place. But the strategy was backfiring. Instead of accepting their reduced status, human colonies were responding with defiance. Trade relationships that had benefited alien corporations were terminated and replaced with agreements between human worlds. Diplomatic ties with species that supported the ban were downgraded, while relationships with more sympathetic civilizations were strengthened. Most significantly, other species were taking notice. The Zelari Trade Confederation, representing several dozen worlds that had always been treated as junior partners by the major powers, issued a statement condemning Resolution to 387CC as discriminatory. The Free Worlds Alliance, a loose association of independent systems, announced that they would not recognize the retroactive nullification of Jake's championship. Lisa had been monitoring galactic communication networks, tracking reactions to the announcement. "Look at this," she said, showing Jake a compilation of news reports from across known space. "It's not just humans who are angry. Dozens of species are questioning the whole system now." The reports showed protests on worlds throughout the galaxy. Beings who had never heard of Jake Morrison were using his story as a symbol of broader frustrations with galactic inequality. The phrase "they couldn't beat it, so they declared it illegal" was appearing in dozens of languages, on protest signs, and in political speeches. High Arbiter Zekthal had tried to preserve the established order by eliminating a threat to galactic hierarchy. Instead, he had created a rallying cry for every species that had ever been told they were not good enough to compete with their supposed superiors. The most significant development came from an unexpected source. Captain Rex Carter of the human cargo vessel Independence contacted Jake directly, introducing himself as a representative of what he called the Nexus Alliance. "We're forming a new organization," Carter explained during their communication. "Humans and other species who are tired of being treated as second-class citizens. We're going to create our own tournaments, our own trade networks, our own diplomatic relationships." "What does that have to do with me?" Jake asked. "You're the reason this is all happening," Carter said. "Your victory showed everyone that merit matters more than politics. We want you to be our first champion, to help us prove that fair competition produces better results than rigged systems." Lisa looked intrigued. "How many species are involved in this alliance?" 47 so far, with more joining every day," Carter replied. "Turns out there are a lot of beings in this galaxy who are tired of being told they're not good enough to compete with the established powers." Jake considered the offer. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a leader. All he had wanted was to deliver his cargo and pay off the penalty fees that had started this whole mess. But he was beginning to understand that some fights were too important to walk away from. "The Combat Council made a mistake," he said finally. "They thought they could solve their problem by making me illegal. But you can't make an idea illegal. And the idea that anyone should have the right to be their best is spreading faster than they can contain it." President Foster's prediction was proving correct. The galactic powers had tried to erase Jake's victory, but they had only succeeded in making it more powerful than any championship title could ever be. 6 months after Resolution 2387CC banned human participation in galactic combat sports, Jake Morrison found himself standing in a completely different kind of arena. The Nexus Alliance had grown from 47 member species to over 200, and their first championship tournament was being held on Harmony Station, a newly constructed facility that orbited a neutral star system. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering. Instead of following the architectural styles preferred by the major galactic powers, Harmony Station incorporated design elements from dozens of different civilizations. The result was something that looked chaotic to traditional eyes but functioned with remarkable efficiency. Lisa had been instrumental in the station's construction, working with engineers from across the Alliance to create facilities that could accommodate the incredible diversity of member species. The fighting arenas featured variable gravity, atmospheric controls, and modular configurations that could be adjusted for different types of competition. "It's not just about the fighting," she explained to Jake as they toured the completed facility. were proving that cooperation between supposedly inferior species can produce results that rival anything the established powers have achieved. The Nexus Alliance had indeed become something much larger than a simple sporting organization. Member species had formed trade partnerships, shared technological innovations, and developed mutual defense agreements. What had started as a response to discriminatory tournament rules had evolved into an alternative power structure that challenged the traditional galactic hierarchy. Jake's role in this transformation had been both symbolic and practical. As the Alliance's first champion, he had helped establish credibility for their new competitive system. But he had also worked with trainers from dozens of different species to develop fighting techniques that emphasized adaptability and creativity over specialized advantages. The training program was revolutionary in its approach. Instead of focusing on the perfection of single combat styles, students learned to integrate methods from multiple species and adapt them to changing circumstances. Human flexibility was combined with Solari speed, Corvani strength, and thermal tactical thinking to create fighters who were truly unpredictable. The old system taught species to perfect their natural advantages, Jake explained to a group of new trainees. We're teaching you to overcome natural disadvantages and find opportunities in unexpected places. The first Nexus Alliance championships drew spectators from across the galaxy, including many beings from worlds that officially supported the traditional galactic order. Despite attempts by major powers to discourage attendance, the tournament became one of the most watched sporting events in recent history. High Arbiter, Zekthal, and the Galactic Combat Council had tried to ignore the Alliance initially, hoping it would collapse without official recognition. When that strategy failed, they began attempting to pressure member species through economic and diplomatic channels. Some worlds withdrew from the Alliance under threat, but many more joined in response to what they saw as intimidation tactics. The tournament structure itself was designed to demonstrate Alliance principles. Instead of eliminating competitors, the early rounds were organized as learning experiences where fighters from different species could study each other's techniques. Only the final stages featured traditional elimination matches, and even defeated competitors were celebrated for their contributions to the overall knowledge base. Jake's first match in the Alliance Championship was against Keshra, a veteran fighter from the Thermal Confederation, who had been banned from traditional tournaments for using unsportsmanlike psychological tactics. The match lasted over an hour, with both fighters adapting their strategies multiple times as they learned from each other's approaches. This is what competition should be, Keshra said after their match, which Jake had won by a narrow margin. Not about proving superiority, but about pushing each other to become better. The sentiment was echoed throughout the tournament. Spectators were witnessing something unprecedented, competitive events where the goal was mutual improvement rather than establishing dominance. Fighters shared techniques between matches. Coaches from different species worked together, and victories were celebrated as achievements for the entire Alliance rather than individual glory. President Amanda Foster attended the tournament as the official representative of human space, but she was accompanied by diplomatic delegations from over 100 other worlds. The gathering had become an unofficial alternative to traditional galactic councils, with informal negotiations taking place between species that had been excluded from major diplomatic initiatives. What you've created here goes far beyond sports, President Foster told Jake during a private meeting. You've given hope to everyone who believed they would never have a fair chance to prove themselves. The economic implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Alliance member species were increasingly trading among themselves, rather than through traditional channels controlled by the major powers. New technologies were being developed through cooperative research projects that included species previously considered too primitive to contribute meaningful innovations. Lisa had been documenting these developments, creating a comprehensive record of how the Alliance was changing galactic society. Look at these trade figures, she said, showing Jake statistical analyses that would have impressed any economic advisor. Alliance commerce has grown by 400% in 6 months. The established powers are starting to take notice, Jake observed. I've been hearing rumors about countermeasures they're considering. Let them try, Lisa said. The more they push, the more species join us. Every discriminatory action they take just proves our point about the unfairness of their system. The tournament's climax came when Jake faced his final opponent, being called Harmony through conflict, from a species that had never been allowed to participate in traditional galactic competitions. Their people were considered too emotionally unstable for civilized sports, but in the Alliance system, emotional intensity was seen as another form of strength. To be channeled constructively, the match was unlike anything spectators had ever seen. Both fighters employed techniques borrowed from multiple species, adapting their strategies in real time as circumstances changed. It was less like a fight and more like a complex dance, with each participant pushing the other to discover new capabilities. When Jake finally achieved victory, the celebration lasted 4 hours. But the most significant moment came when Harmony through conflict requested permission to address the audience. In broken but passionate galactic standard, the being spoke about hope, about fairness, about the chance to prove that every species had something valuable to contribute. For generations, my people were told we were too chaotic for civilized society, Harmony through conflict said. Today, chaos and civilization embraced each other, and both became stronger. High Arbiter, Zekthal, watched the tournament broadcast from his office on Nexus Prime, surrounded by advisors who seemed increasingly worried about the Alliance's growing influence. The traditional galactic powers were facing a crisis they had not anticipated. Their authority was being undermined not by military force or economic pressure, but by the simple demonstration that their version of civilization was not the only valid option. We need to take action, one advisor suggested. The Alliance is becoming too powerful to ignore. What action? Zekthal asked. We cannot ban their tournaments without appearing even more tyrannical. We cannot match their growth without abandoning our own principles of species hierarchy. Perhaps we should reconsider those principles, another advisor said quietly. The suggestion was met with shocked silence. For beings who had built their entire worldview around the concept of natural superiority, admitting that their assumptions might be wrong was almost unthinkable. Meanwhile, on Harmony Station, Jake Morrison stood before an audience of billions, holding a championship trophy that represented something far more significant than personal achievement. Behind him were fighters from 200 different species, all of whom had been given a fair chance to prove themselves regardless of their world's political status or perceived evolutionary level. They told us we were too chaotic to compete fairly, Jake said, his words being translated into hundreds of languages across the galaxy. They declared our abilities illegal rather than admit we might be their equals. Today, we proved that fairness isn't about maintaining order. It's about giving everyone the chance to show what they're capable of achieving. The crowd's response was deafening, but Jake could see that the real victory was not in the noise or the celebration. It was in the faces of beings who had never believed they would live to see a day when merit mattered more than politics, when cooperation produced better results than domination, when the galaxy's supposed inferiors could build something that rivaled the achievements of their supposed superiors. President Foster approached the podium as the celebration continued. Mr. Morrison, on behalf of the Nexus Alliance, and everyone who believes in fair competition, I want to thank you for showing us that sometimes the best response to being declared illegal is to prove that the law itself is wrong. Jake looked out at the diverse crowd of Alliance members, then up at the viewing screens, showing similar celebrations on worlds throughout known space. Somewhere out there, High Arbiter, Zekthal, and his allies were probably planning new strategies to contain the Alliance's influence. Let them come, Jake said quietly to Lisa, who was standing beside him recording everything for posterity. They couldn't beat us when we were alone. They definitely can't beat us now that we're together. The Nexus Alliance had started as a response to discrimination, but it had evolved into something much more significant, proof that the galaxy's established order was not natural or inevitable, just one option among many, and for the first time in centuries, beings across known space were free to choose which option they preferred.